Just pass it through. We do not stand on and on for the
Morning. We're going to wait till you got here to start, so we're honoring your presence. Not your gifts, but, your presence. Good morning, everyone. If you're streaming with us, here we are at our normal time. See, I can make fun of myself. Doug's been doing it all morning, so I thought I'd chime in. I'm kidding. I categorically unfair. No, he hasn't. I'm kidding. So we're in Judges chapter 6, and our goal is to end up at this dream that is had that is really, really quite interesting. But we started at the beginning of Judges 6 with meeting Gideon, learning some things about him. And I also found in verse 11 and 12 this interaction he has with this angel that, kind of goes back to our previous study of about a month ago. And his interaction with this angel that appears to be in flesh, holding this staff, and then the sacrifice that is given, which also kind of harkens back to the beginning of the temple where God issues fire that comes down for these sacrifices. And I think gives us a little insight when Nadab and Abihu happen and the fire comes down. That not only wasn't unusual, but that's how the sacrifices were consumed during these times. So the angel does this, and then the gives him this mission that you are going to go save your people from the Midianites. Verse 14, I am sending you. And then as we discussed in verse 15, Gideon has a very rational question. How can it be me? My clan's the weakest. I'm the weakest in my clan. And so help me understand your choice here. And then God's answer, which is very interesting also. How is Gideon going to save his people from the Midianites? And the answer is, I will be with you. I am going to save them, and you are simply the jar of clay, so to speak, to do that. So Gideon replied, and this is kind of where we begin today. Gideon replies in verse 17, if you're truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that it is really the Lord speaking to me. And don't go away until I come back and bring my offering to you. And the Lord replies, I will stay here until you return. When you get into some of the places in the New Testament with Jesus seems to, maybe the word is scoff a little, be a little frustrated with the people asking for a sign. And I find it interesting in a lot of places, New and Old Testament, that sometimes a question is asked, a thing is wanted, and the response is, yes, cool, let's do that, that's fine. And other times the response is, you are stubborn, or you are uncircumcised hearts, those kind of ideas. And so it's interesting to see the difference in how the Lord responds to these different desires. Because here he asks for a sign, and the Lord seems to be not only good with that, but very allowing of it. When you get into John 6, of course, that's after the sign of the feeding of the 5,000. They wanted a sign, and what was Jesus' response to that in John 6? At the end of that sign, you're a corrupt, uncircumcised heart kind of people. You're not asking this because you actually want what I have to give. You're asking because I filled your stomachs and you want that to keep going. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Right. Right.
But these other circumstances where it's, what can you do for me?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
To have a relationship or trust.
Right. Right. And in fact, in that moment, to your point, he called him out on that, of what they were wanting. And he made it very apparent why his reaction was what it was. And so in this case, Gideon had a very seemingly legitimate need. Can you show me that this is what's going to happen? And how does the Lord respond to Gideon's need? Sure, let's do this. But in John 6 and in seemingly other places where they asked for a sign, they did not want the Savior. They wanted either wars to be fought, their stomachs to be fed, etc. And he had given them signs up to that point anyway that they really need to be watchful of and aware of. Yeah.
Distinction between I don't believe you, show me, prove it to me, versus I believe you, but I need assurance, I need confirmation. I believe this is right. You see the same thing with like Mary and Zechariah. Two seemingly similar situations. One ends up being mute, and the other one is blessed. And so, there's a subtle line there between where that belief falls, where the faith lies.
Yeah. And another very interesting example, or what's the word I'm looking for? Because Mary is given this is what's going to happen, and she says, what does she say? Okay. Yeah. So, and yet it's not so much needing a sign. How can this be? The conversation goes on, and she says, okay. Zechariah is like, Now, I don't think it's a male-female thing. It's probably more of a personality thing. Who knows? So, without necessarily exhausting this anymore, I encourage you to maybe, in your off time, think about these moments where a sign is asked for, a thing is offered, and the person's response in terms of their heart, hey, I'm in. Can we just do something visible for me to see it? And yeah, maybe so. Yeah. And that to me is a whole fascinating conversation about what is meant. What does John mean there by, test the spirits in that context within that audience? Making sure that what you hear is actually God's teachings. Because I think today, there are things that may be put in our lap by the Lord, and I don't know if our humanity will allow us to say, let's do it, let's go, let's jump in. Maybe that could be a personality thing as well. But here, Gideon says, and again, this is our English phrasing of it, but he tells the Lord, don't go until I bring back an offering to you. And so maybe that also had some connection there too. Gideon's not just standing there in front of the Lord. I'm going to bring an offering. Can we do this back and forth? Kind of like we find happening with Moses. Although Moses, didn't bring an offering. And so the Lord responds, I will stay here until you return. So this whole process that he goes through of getting the offering together, which took work and time and money. And then once the offering was consumed, and this is where we find the fire coming down and consuming the offering, Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord. He cried out, "All sovereign Lord, I'm doomed. I've seen the angel of the Lord." And so this place is then called the Lord is Peace. And so that night the Lord said to Gideon, goes through the second bull, tearing down his father's altars. And when you get to verse 25, again, how interesting here that he then calls upon him to build this altar and to tear down the altars of his father. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had commanded. But he did it at night because he was afraid of the other members of the father's household and the people of the town. Now, one of the reasons I want to share with you that we're kind of going through all this instead of just going right to the dream of the servant is all of these things that are happening, these developments that are going on, before we get to Gideon with his, this other guy crawling through the people, hearing this dream, believing it, and then going in and taking care of the Midianites. These other things take place. It is a building process. And one of the things I think is important for us to realize when we read these kinds of stories is to not take them out in blocks of lessons, blocks of happenings, but to realize that sometimes when we get to those places of a dream where we need to move forward, we also need to realize the things that God has done maybe in the past month, the past 6 months, the past year, 2 years of our life to build and develop us to these moments. And I don't know that Gideon just goes full force after this dream that this Midianite guy has.
Keeps going back and forth, and even after the angel disappears, he's still talking to the Lord.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe he didn't know either.
And I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't. I know we had the whole number of weeks on angels and other things, but yeah, how interesting that is it's the angels and the Lord Himself are interchangeable often. We find that with the talking to Moses. We find that with the law given at Sinai, where in one place it's the Lord talking, another setting it's actually called an angel of the Lord that is doing it. You remember we looked at that in Exodus. It's the Lord meeting Moses at the mountain. In Acts 7, Stephen calls it an angel of the Lord that delivered the law to Moses. So, the idea of a messenger of the Lord representing the Lord and having the same authority and message as the Lord Himself, because the Lord gives the message to the messenger. And so that interchangeability that is there, which we find in many situations happening here as well.
He perceived that he was the angel of the Lord.
Yes.
In this particular context, it's an angel of the Lord.
Yeah. So I encourage you to notice here, as we kind of take these clumps of happenings that are connected, the courage here that Gideon has to have for the Lord to tell him, I want you to go and tear down your father's Asherah poles, tear down his pagan offering places. And so Gideon goes and finds 10 of his servants. So Gideon has servants. So he's not just this, this schmuck out there that's threshing the floor and doing these things, even though he perceives himself as the least. He has people, they're called here servants, which kind of could be a loaded term for us. He takes 10 of these guys with him and did as the Lord had commanded. When does he do it? I mean, you guys know the story. Does it at night, which may be here nor there. Does it at night because he was afraid of the other members of his father's household and the people of the town. So early in the morning, as the people of the town began to stir, someone discovered that the altar of Baal had been broken down and the Asherah pole beside it had been cut down. In their place, a new altar had been built, and on it were the remains of the bull that had been sacrificed.
The People society. So going against your
Yeah.
father was much
Oh.
more serious than it is in our society.
Huge. Huge. So we find this, and again, you know, these different scenes that God is developing Gideon. And I would imagine this didn't take a couple of days, but this took a little longer for all this to develop and work itself out. This confidence and courage that God is developing for Gideon and calling on him to do this. And, you know, it doesn't seem as though God has any negativity about this, whether it's him calling his servants, going at night, because he was afraid of his father's household and the members of the people of the town. He did have that nervousness and that fear. And this may be a nice little tiny thread to pull out of this, that when God calls us to do something, can we be afraid? Can we be nervous? Can we be anxious? Can we have some things we're not sure about? And obviously the answer is yes. You know, we're human. And it doesn't mean that we don't have faith and trust in God. It means that we're human. And we have some, you know, trepidation about some of the things coming up.
Might have been stopped,
Yeah, exactly.
so he wouldn't have been able to complete God's command.
He was actually wise and smart about what he was doing.
The angel of the Lord said, do it. And Gideon
Yeah.
did.
And Gideon
It
made
doesn't
it
appear
happen.
to be any restriction on when he did.
Right. Or how he did.
Why he chose night, perfectly reasonable.
That's interference.
Yeah. It's actually a smart thing to do, Carol.
Well, it seemed like Gideon was being asked to do a pretty big thing
Yeah.
to people that have terrorized them. So you can't fault him for his fear, but it
Right.
seems the Lord tolerated his fear and tried to strengthen and reassure him.
Right.
And I think there's a difference between that and just, I don't believe you, you know.
Yeah. And I also find it interesting, and I don't know how we connect this or merge it together. But you know, in Philippians 4, when it talks about do not be anxious for anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, I think there are times that we can make that verse just an umbrella over everything. And then when we do get anxious, or we do get worried, or we do get fearful, we somehow feel like we have gone against that verse and faith in God and trust and all those kind of ideas. Is there times in life whenever we are going to be anxious? Yeah, fearful, unsure, questioning the next steps forward, of course. Does that affect or bother our faith? And I don't think it does. I think we need to look a little deeper into Philippians 4 and understand in that place what Paul is referring to. Because here, Gideon's afraid, but he does it. And why does Gideon do this? Because his faith propels him to. That's what God called him to do. And so he does it, even though he is afraid, and he does it at night.
But I think that he's more fearful of the Lord than he is of what these men can do to him. And so it's, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Right.
So I think he's afraid of what may happen because of these men, but at the same time, he fears the Lord more.
Yeah.
So that's the decision.
Yeah. And you know, to that point, imagine, and whether he had seen this before or not, what happens to the sacrifice that he made for the Lord, that he asked God, I'm going to make an offering, don't go away, and God said, okay, and so they makes the offering. What happens to that offering? How? Fire from the staff from this angel. So it's not as if it just like poof went away. It was, I imagine, a pretty interesting visual that God did right there in front of him with this angel. And so it's not as if there hasn't been any visual of God's presence and God being there. So this fear, this reverence, this awe of who is there. And then he tells them, I want you to go and tear down your father's, altar situation. And so it's almost as if you can imagine Gideon going, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go at night, and I'm going to bring some dudes with me. I'm going to bring some backup, So, again, I find a lot of interesting things here that not so much whether God's good with it or not, but it happens. And Gideon continues to move forward in this whole process that God has put out in front of him. And I think we can learn a lot of good lessons about ourselves, that how God is using us, and the fear that we're probably going to have in different situations. Doesn't mean God has left us, doesn't mean our faith is low. It means we're human, and we can move forward in that confident structure.
He's great, Joseph was a great man who did amazing things, was righteous, all the way through, and was blessed by God, and it's like, man, I don't know if I could ever be Joseph. Gideon is someone I can relate with, right? Gideon is someone who does not look at himself as being great,
Right.
Looks at himself as being among the weakest, and yet is used by God and goes along with the plan in spite of the fact that he used himself as being weak. So I can relate to it.
Yeah, for sure. As you were talking, in this, I am fully aware, everybody that's listening to me right now, that I have a tendency to overthink things. But to the Hebrews, numbers were not just a big thing; they were sewn into everything. How many guys did Gideon take with him to tear down his father's? 10. So 10's a pretty big number in Hebrew numerology. It's a very important number. I'm not saying that he didn't actually take 10 guys, but just an interesting note there. And one of the challenges I think we have is we just don't read or appreciate Hebrew literature. And I'm not saying that keeps us from understanding stuff, but it is interesting that it's 10 versus 8 or some other number. So he goes at night, does this. The next morning, there's a big stir. And not only is Baal's altar broken down and the Asherah poles beside it cut down, but there is a new altar there, and the new altar has a sacrifice. So think in terms of, just within these 3 verses, what happened in the evening hours? The altar has been prepared. Well, one's been torn down, one's been built up, and an offering was prepared. 30 minutes? About an hour? This is an all-evening thing, isn't it? So Gideon is there with his men, no doubt freaking out. Is someone going to hear us? Are the people going to come? No doubt work all night to get this done. And not only did they tear down one and build up the other and offer a sacrifice, but what happened to the sacrifice? In the last part of verse 28, the remains of the bull that had been sacrificed. So God took it as well. God did with this what the angel did with the other one. So the people said to each other, verse 29, is that 29? Yes. Who did this? And after asking around and making a careful search, they learned that it was Gideon, the son of Joash. That careful search reminds me of Luke chapter 1. Luke made a careful search of all the information about this guy, Jesus. So bring out your son, that the men of the town demanded of Joash. He must die for destroying the altar of Baal and for cutting down the Asherah poles. So why did Gideon go at night? Because he knew this would happen. If he got caught during the day, he's a dead man. So the thing God asked Gideon to do, no doubt would result in Gideon what? Dying. They would kill him. So he does it at night. God is developing his faith, developing his assurance, that ultimately, so what did God begin this whole process with? What is God calling Gideon to do? Ultimately, you can defeat the Midianites. But in the process, you have calling Midianites. What happens in the intervening time? Yeah. A whole bunch of stuff. So, to Doug's point, in terms of the great example of Gideon, when God calls us to do X, he's either been developing us, or it's like, look, in the intervening years, I'm going to develop you. I'm gonna get you there. It's not as if I'm calling you who you are now. We're going to get you there.
We do have these scenes also where you have God calling people to consecrate themselves before taking
Yes.
And I think that's kind of what's happening here. It's tearing down the wrong altar.
Right.
The right one offering the sacrifice on. It's kind of a consecration moment before you head into battle.
Yeah.
The Lord is on your side, but you need to consecrate yourself.
Yeah. Great point. And I think that's something for us to consider, that before we do some big stuff, God's going to consecrate us. And it doesn't mean necessarily that we need to stop or start anything. It's God's going to get us ready, and consecration is getting us ready. But it is also, you're not going to defeat this great army, these Midianites, with a bunch of Baal altars strewn all over the place. That's not going to happen. So tear those things down, and then we will go in and take care of the Midianites, this holy God that's going to help them do that.
People might say, Baal did this.
Right.
No, Baal couldn't defend his own altar.
Stinking altar. Yeah. So as a result of this, Joash, they're asking for the life of Gideon. But Joash shouted to the mob that confronted him, and who knows how big this mob is, why are you defending Baal? What an interesting question. Why are you defending Baal? Will you argue his case? Whoever pleads his case will be put to death by morning. If Baal truly is God, let him defend himself and destroy the one who broke down his altar. This is also an interesting kind of linkage and connecting the dots with Elijah, the prophets of Baal. If Baal is really here, he will answer your calling, and he will take care of your offering, if that's the case. If Baal is truly God, he's going to defend himself, and he's going to destroy the one that broke down his altar. From then on, Gideon was known as Jerubbaal, which means let Baal defend himself, because he broke down Baal's altar. And the little bit that I've looked over the years at Hebrew literature, and when I say the little bit I've looked at it, I mean very, very surfacey. When it talks about from that point on, it doesn't mean they called him Jerubbaal from that point on. It means in this moment, in this idea that happened, was where he had that attached to him because of this situation, and because he broke down Baal's altar. See,
Dad is now defending him, whereas it calls out that it was his father's Asherah pole and altar.
Yeah.
So it was a real 180.
Yeah. And you also kind of wonder for Gideon, this odd time of faith building where the option to kill Gideon was right there in front of them. And yet his dad, who's the one who had these Baal altars built, is the one not only pleads for him, but Gideon doesn't die. He's not killed as a result of what he does here. And who is the one that saves him, really, is his dad from this mob. So you kind of wonder what clout his dad had in the town. You know, to Bob's point, probably a very important patriarch there. Yeah.
I really like Gideon's dad's reply because how many times do we get set on a thought or a mission or something that we think is so right? This is what these people were doing. Like, we're defending that. And his dad brings out something and it's like, oh, well, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I guess my idea wasn't that intelligent.
Yeah.
I like that because like there's people like
Yeah, never considered that. And again, his dad must have held a lot of weight in the town, because for them not only to listen to his thoughts, but also as a result, turn and not kill Gideon, and not even seemingly, look, that's fine, and Baal can take care of himself, but we're still going to tear down this altar and rebuild. You know, Baal, they don't seem to do that. So Gideon at this point has grown in these different ways. And, you know, what we're going to look at next week is another sign that he's going to ask of God. And God not only goes with it, but much like Moses, God entertains all of this before we even get to the Midianite army and Gideon's, or the Midianite guy's dream. So, all right. Any other thoughts or comments? Interesting stuff. All right. Well, let's close with a prayer. Loving God, we thank you for these great stories that you give to us that teach us about our confidence in you and the allowances that you make with our anxiety, our fear, our questions that we have, and that you are not only willing but ready to interact with us and to build courage and to build our confidence in you. Father, help us not only stick with you, but know and have the assurance that you're going to stick with us as we share your message and share your good news, share your love within this world. Father, thank you for all that you do for us.